In the last lesson, we set up our Xcode project as well as all of the views and models. If you missed that, check that playlist out right over here. In this lesson, we're going to be connecting to the YouTube Data API and retrieving the data. And because we've done this already in a demo project, this should be pretty straightforward. The only difference is that this time we're going to securely store the API key. Let's dive right in. First, let's review the endpoint that we're going to hit with our app. So on the YouTube Data API, and I'll link to this document below in case you lost the reference to it, we're going to be hitting this endpoint, playlist items. Essentially, we want to list out all of the videos for a certain playlist. Now, this is the URL, and it's going to be a get type of request. And the required parameters, so this is what we must specify, is going to be one of these. Like, what level of detail do you want for the video items that get returned in the response? And through my testing in building this demo, I've come to the conclusion that snippet is what you need. Now, it doesn't exactly tell you what is included in each of these. Maybe there's an additional documentation you can search up somewhere. But what you can do is, in the previous lesson when we tested out hitting the API, you can just try out all of these parameters and see what you get back and see what you need. Now, what you should be targeting is getting back as little data as possible while still satisfying what you need to do, because you never want to return more data because that takes more bandwidth, it takes more time, and why would you just do that? So snippet is what we need. It's going to contain the title, description, the video image URLs, and that's pretty much all we need, to be honest. Now, according to this documentation, this is the only required parameter. However, we still need to specify the playlist ID. Otherwise, what videos are we going to get back? We need to tell YouTube, this is the playlist that I want to get the videos back for, right? And this was what sort of threw me off in the beginning. I thought I would put the playlist ID in there, but no, you put it in there. Okay, so that is the endpoint we're going to hit. Now, in terms of the API key that we need to pass in, you should have signed up for this back in lesson 1. If you haven't, just go back to lesson 1 and walk through that process, and you can sign up for your own API key. Now we're going to jump into Xcode and see how we can securely store this API key. I hope you're enjoying the lesson so far. Now, just in case you want to launch your own app, I want to tell you about CWC+. This step-by-step program will help you launch your own app even if you don't have any experience. And it takes about 4 months. If this sounds like something you're interested in, I have a special offer for you. I'll leave the link in the description below this video, and hopefully I'll see you there. If not, no worries. I really appreciate that you're here watching this lesson and learning with us. So thank you for that. Anyways, now back to the lesson. First, I want to talk about what storing your API key securely even means, because there are so many different ways to do it, and there are varying degrees of effectiveness. So first, let's talk about not securing the API key, which is what we did when we were demoing the API, right, in the previous lesson. So we hard-coded the API key directly in the Xcode project, and that's bad because you may accidentally share your project with someone or put it on source control. So if you're not familiar with source control like GitHub, it is a way for a team to collaborate, multiple people to work on the same code base. So if it gets on source control, especially if it's an open source project, or if it's, who knows who has access to it, right? Your key is right there and anybody can take it and abuse it. So that's what you do not want. Now, one level of sophistication or protection is by putting that API key in an external file. So you do not include it directly in the Xcode project, but it sits in a different file. And then you have your Xcode project read the key from that file. In this way, when you put your project onto GitHub, as you can see in this diagram, the key doesn't go along with it. The key stays in that file on your computer. And then you have to manually share that external file with the key to whoever needs access, right? Or that person gets their own API key and puts it in the config file and combines it with the Xcode project. Now, the problem with these two methods is that ultimately your Xcode project still needs the API key. And the reason for that is because we are making the network calls to the API directly from our project or our app, right? So our project needs the key in order to access and authenticate against that API. There's no way around this, right? Your Xcode project needs to know about the key. So if you think about the App Store, when your app is downloaded, right, that package that is downloaded has everything it needs to work, right? Including the API key, because ultimately your app is going to be using that API key to connect to any APIs which your phone or your app uses. So it's still, if someone tries hard enough and they know what they're doing, probably can extract the key out from that package. Ultimately, the most secure way to do this would be to not even make the API calls from your app. You would set up your own API, and your app would make requests to your API, and it's your API that has the API key that then makes access to the third-party API. So in this example, that would be the YouTube API, and then it would get the data back from the YouTube API and then return that data back to the app, right? So it's almost like a middleman, and which has access to the key. So then that way the client, which is your app, will never see the key. And then what you can do is you can have that app have its own like user account system that the user needs to sign up for and authenticate himself or herself in order to even hit your API. So you can see how far you can take this, right? And it really depends. I think, to me, it depends how many people are using your app and how critical it is that this API key never fall into the wrong hands. At the very least, we should put the API key in an external file and not inside hard-coded in the project. This is just a good practice as you're building your app. Now, in terms of setting up your own software and having your app never use the API key, to me, that is a later stage thing. Let's say your app picks up traction and there's lots of users using it, gets on the news, and you think there may be a risk that someone could target your app, maybe competition or whatever it may be, to target your app to try to bring it down because your business has taken off. I think that's a good problem to have. And then you would then think about, how can I make my app more secure? And then go through this process of setting up your own API. So I wanted to go through all of that so that you can get an understanding of what it means to secure your API key. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to put your API key in an external file. So here are the steps we're going to go through. We're going to create a config file in our Xcode project, and we're going to add the key to it. We're going to set the project to use this config file, and we're going to define a special variable in our plist to reference that API key. And we're not going to do steps 4 and 5 because we're not dealing with source control in this project, but steps 4 and 5, they are the steps you want to do if you are putting this project into source control, because the git ignore file lists all the files that should not be put on source control, like should not be uploaded to GitHub, essentially. So steps 4 and 5, those are things that you definitely want to do if you are putting this project into source control or GitHub and you're working on a team. If you're curious about how those are done, I would just Google how to use a git ignore file, and it's literally just listing your config file, like the file name, inside that git ignore file, which is essentially just a text file. And you include that git ignore file with your Xcode project. And then when you push your project onto source control, it's going to read that git ignore file and take note of all the files which it should exclude, and it will not put those files into source control. So now let's dive into our Xcode project and do steps 1, 2, and 3. So here's our Xcode project. Let's start by adding that external file. And this is going to be a configuration file. So let's right click on this main folder here, new file. And at the top right corner, you'll see a filter box. Type in configuration, just type config. This is the file that we want, a configuration settings file. Now, the important thing to note here is that you do not want to include it as part of the target here. You just make sure that's unchecked and then create, because you don't want to include it, right? Now you type in API_key in all caps, and notice we don't this is not a variable or constant. We don't put any Swift keywords in front of it. This is more of like a text file. Now equals, and we are going to bring up our API key. Okay, so there it is. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it in there and save the file. Next, we are going to configure our Xcode project to use this configuration file by tapping on the root node here, tapping on project, and under configurations here, you can see there's no configuration set. There are two different types of builds that we can create when we are developing and we're testing in the simulator or on our devices. It's what's called a debug build. A release build is when you create a build specifically to deploy or send to the App Store. And that doesn't contain all of the extra stuff that's only used in the development phase of the app, such as the bug symbols and things like that. Anyways, for both of these, debug and release build, we are going to set it to use config like that. Okay, now the third and final step before we can test this is to go under targets here. We're going to go into info. This is our plist, and we are going to create a key that we can use to reference that value in the config file. So at the bottom, hit plus, and then you're going to type in all capitals API underscore capital KEY. Press enter, and the type is going to be string. I don't know why it was a lowercase p, because I think there was some autocorrect funkiness. Let's correct that and change that to a capital P. And then as for the value, this is going to be a dynamic variable or reference, and it's going to refer to the API key in the config file. So what we're going to do inside our Swift code right here is we are going to go into this plist and grab the value for this key. And the value for this key is actually pointing to this config file, which we are not going to include as part of the project when it gets put into source control and all that stuff. This is our external file like we talked about before. So let's test this out. We're going to go into the home view and we're going to say on appear. We are just going to print out the API key, see if we can reference it. And the way we reference that info.plist is by saying bundle.main.info.dictionary. That's our info plist. And this is optional because it may return nil. So if it can find it, then we are going to search for the key. And we are going to try to retrieve the value because it has no idea of what the value is. We know it's a string, it's a type of string, so we're going to try to turn it into a string. And this is just try. If it can't, then it'll probably be empty or nil. We could provide a default value. So yeah, if it can't find anything, let's print can't find it. Okay, just for our own debugging. Okay, so let's try this out. We are going to run this in the simulator. And so it's running right now. And we should see our API key print out there if everything is according to plan. All right, perfect. It works. So this is referencing the info.plist, looking for this key, and the value for this key is referencing the config file API key right here. Perfect. Now let's move on to implementing the data service, where we're going to send off the API call to the YouTube API and to retrieve the data. So in the data service file at the top, let's declare our key as a private constant, and we're going to call this the API key. And we're going to handle this just like I showed you before, bundle.main.info.dictionary, and we're going to try to look for API underscore key as a string. And now I'm not going to give it a value like this if it can't retrieve it, because I do want it to be nil, and that way we can detect if the API key is present or not. All right, next we are going to create a new function called getVideos, and it is going to return an array of videos. Essentially, I wanted to give back all of the videos for a given playlist, right? So we are going to make this an asynchronous function, and I will explain what that means when it comes time that we call this, and I'll explain what the async and await keywords mean. All right, so for now, why don't we just return an empty video array, and here we're going to implement that API call. So first, check if API key is there, and then we are going to create the URL, create the request, and we're going to send the request, and then finally parse it. So this really helps that we did this inside a demo back in lesson 2, right? So we've tested that this works, we know it works. So we're going to say guard API key not equal nil, else return. We can return an empty video list, okay, because it can't get anything. Ideally, what you'd want to do is probably show an error message or something so you can return something as such and then capture it and display it to the UI. But by doing what we're doing here, you're returning no videos, so the user doesn't know if there's actually no videos in that playlist or if something went wrong. But clearly something went wrong because we can't get the API key, right? Okay, so coming down here, we're going to create the URL. And before we create the URL, actually, we're going to create it off of a string, right? And that URL string is going to look something like this. So first, let's go back to the documentation. So that is right here. And as I mentioned in the previous lesson, we are using this endpoint right here. So we're going to retrieve all of the playlist items given a playlist. So I'm just going to put that right there. I'm going to hard code that URL right here. And we're going to add the parameters. So one of the required parameters is this one, part. I mentioned before in lesson 3 why I picked snippet, because it contains what we need. And then the other thing we want to specify is which playlist do we want to target to retrieve all of the videos for. Okay, so the way you find this is, I'm going to choose my own playlist. You can choose whatever playlist you'd like, but if you go to someone's channel and you go to playlist, you'll see all of the playlists here. I'm going to click on this one, view full playlist, and it's just this ID right here. If you double click it, it'll highlight the whole thing. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste that in there. And the last thing you have to add is the key. So we're going to say key is equal to, and we will just insert that right here, API key. And we've already checked that it's not nil, so we're going to just force unwrap it here. Okay, so now we can create the URL instance off of that string. And now we can create the request. So let's do that, URL request, and we're going to do it off of this one right here. I'm going to pass in the URL, and actually this one returns an optional. So this could be nil. So we're going to say if let URL equals URL, just to check that it's not nil. I'm going to put all of this code in here that only executes if we're successfully able to create a URL instance. So then we're going to do that in there. And then sending off the request is a matter of using session. So if we say, let's create another constant right here just to make things more clear. So URL session.shared. This is just breaking things up so it's easier for you to understand. And if you look at this one, which is what we're going to use, data, like it retrieves the data for a given URL request, which we have created up here. And it is both an asynchronous method and it also potentially throws errors. So we have to address both of those things. And the third thing I want you to notice with this method is what it returns to you. It returns a tuple. So it has two pieces of data. It has data, which is the actual data that is returned by the API, and a response object, which you can take a look at for any errors or the status code and things like that. So that is the actual response, and that is the data separated into its own parameter. So we're going to also handle that. But first, let's do things one at a time. Let's handle the throws part. And then we're going to do async, and then we're going to handle the data that gets returned. So throws. Okay, so let's pass in the request. If calling a method may throw an error, we have to catch it. And the mechanism in Swift to do that is to, it looks like this. So you do something that may potentially throw errors, which is this line of code. You have to put a try keyword in front of it. So we're going to try to do this, right? And then you have to also have a catch block. And this displays, or you can handle any errors that get thrown if it gets thrown. So we're just going to print it out. Okay, and this will reference the error that gets thrown out. Next, let's handle the fact that this is an asynchronous method. So in order to call the asynchronous method, which means that it gets called in a background thread or a background worker. So imagine yourself tasking someone else to do the work, like you're giving someone else a task, and have that person go and do the task and come back to you when it's done. Right? You have to put the await keyword, which means that you are going to wait for that person, that background worker, to come back with the completed task before you continue and execute the rest of the lines of code below it. So that's what's going to happen here. Now I do want to explain, even though it waits for the background worker to do that task and comes back before we execute the next lines of code, it is still good because while we're waiting for that background task to come back, we can handle any sort of user interaction, and we can also do some other things before we execute the next lines of code. It's just that the await keyword tells the system, do not run lines 33 and below until that background worker comes back. Right? And for things like this, you do want to send it off as a background task, because if you have the main thread, which is, you know, the main thread that is executing this code, go and do that work, there will be no worker to handle all of the user interaction and stuff, and so it'll look like it's frozen. So that's kind of the gist of it. With any sort of tasks like network requests or database queries, and you'll see when we do the thumbnail downloading for the images, we're also going to send that as a background worker to go and do that. Right? So that's using the async and await keywords. The fact that this is an asynchronous method will also come into play when we have the feed view call get video. You're going to see how we use the await keyword. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If not, I would recommend that you dive a little deeper into async and await. Search for some additional tutorials on async and await in Swift so you can understand it in a little more detail, more than we have time to cover right now. So we've handled the fact that it throws an error. We've handled the fact that it's an asynchronous method, meaning a background worker is going to go execute it. Now we have to handle the data that comes back, and it's a tuple, right? So we are going to declare our own tuple to track that data. So we're going to declare a tuple constant. We're going to say data and response. So you'll notice that this format looks like what we saw this method returns. We're going to say equals this. So if no errors get thrown when the background worker comes back, it's going to assign the data to this, and it's going to assign the response to this. And then from here, we can parse the data. Now, before we actually parse the data, let's try sending this request off and taking a look at it inside Proxyman to make sure that it's happening. So what we're going to do first, we have to actually fire off this request. So inside the feed view, right here, why don't we say on not on up here, but we're going to use task. Let me explain what that is. So the task is a modifier that lets you execute a block of asynchronous code. Let me put that into layman's terms. When the feed view appears, it is going to run this code inside this task block as a background worker. So we are going to say, we're going to create a property up here to store the videos. And this is going to be a state property. Let me explain what that means as well. Okay, it's going to be an empty array in the beginning. In case you haven't watched my 8-day beginner series where I explained what state properties are, it's essentially when this value changes, we want the UI to refresh. So this starts off as an empty array. There are no videos, right? But when we send off the task from the data service, right, to retrieve the videos, and it comes back and then it puts the video instances into this array, we want the user interface to refresh and show those videos. That's why this is a state property. All right, so let's fire off this task. So we are going to create a new data service instance, and I'm just going to chain it like this. I'm going to call get video. Oh, that should be an S. We'll change that. This should be get videos, and notice that it's an asynchronous method and it returns a list of videos. So asynchronous means we're going to have to send it off as a background task. We're going to have to wait for that to come back before executing the code below it. Okay, so we're going to say let videos equals that, the returned list of videos. Let's call it returned videos, right? And then we are going to assign the returned videos to our state property here. Self.videos equals returned videos. Okay, so we can shorten this definitely, but I wanted to break this up into 2 lines to explain to you the fact that this line of code will not execute until this has gone and come back with the data because of this await keyword, right? And while the main worker is waiting for the background worker to retrieve the data, it can still handle user interaction and other things that it needs to do. So that's what's so great about async and await. So we can shorten this by just putting this like this, right? And removing the need for this even, right? But I thought writing it like that would explain the await keyword a little bit better. So with the way we've set it up now, if we run this in the simulator, it should execute this and then send off the network request. And if our API is correct and our request is structured properly, we should get a response. So let's go ahead and open up Proxyman. And let's go ahead and take a look, see this in action. So I'm going to first run this in the simulator so that it'll show up on our list. There it is. I'm going to pin this one to the top, and I am going to have to resend it. Hello world, did it send it? All right, the status code is green. This should be a 200. Yeah, 200, and we get the data back here. You can see the root element contains an array of items. So this root element, we represent it with our playlist model. We're going to model it off of that. And then as for the items, these are the individual videos, which we are representing with instances of video. Well, obviously we haven't filled it out yet, but that's what we're going to do. So if you open one of these videos, you're going to see that it has the snippet, which is what we asked for in the API request, and it contains the thumbnails, the title, the description, and the video ID is also something that we need. So inside resource ID, here's the video ID. And so those are all the details we need. And inside thumbnails, you can see that it has different sizes of thumbnails. Each size has a different URL. All right, we're about halfway there. Now that we have the request sending out, the data coming back, all we need to do is parse that JSON data into usable video instances in our app so that we can display it. And we're gonna do that in the next lesson. And if you're enjoying this build so far, can you give this video a thumbs up? I greatly appreciate it. And if you were able to follow along, to add your API key and to send off the network request, drop a comment down below and say, so far, so good. All right, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next lesson.